The woman behind the desk had pink fingernails. That was the first thing Wren Calloway noticed when she sat down across from her in that small, fluorescent office that smelled like copy paper and burned coffee. Pink fingernails perfectly shaped, not a chip on any of them. The kind of nails that belonged to a woman who came home every evening to a house with a working furnace and a refrigerator that hummed and a bed that didn't fold down from a wall. The woman's name was printed on a plastic placard near her computer monitor. Karen Aldrich, caseworker, Division of Family Services. She was somewhere in her 40s, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, a stack of manila folders beside her elbow that represented, as far as Wren could tell, the accumulated wreckage of other people's lives reduced to paperwork and carbon copies. Karen Aldrich picked up a rubber stamp, pressed it into an ink pad, and brought it down onto a file folder, with a sound like a small door being slammed shut. The sound was not loud, but in that small office with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead and the distant cry of a baby somewhere down the hall, it landed like a verdict. She didn't look up when she spoke. "If you don't have a fixed address within 30 days, she said, we'll have to reassess the current custody arrangement." Wren heard the words. She understood them in the way a person understands the sound of ice cracking beneath their feet, not as an abstract possibility, but as a physical fact, immediate and irreversible. She felt them move through her chest the way cold water moves through a body reaching every corner. She did not look at Della. She could not look at Della. Because if she looked at Della sitting in the orange plastic chair on the other side of the waiting area, holding that brown bear with the missing button eye that Owen had bought at a gas station the Christmas before everything changed, if she looked at her daughter's face and saw what had been living in it for the past 4 months, the stillness, the absence, the way a 7-year-old child could look out at the world from behind her own eyes like someone watching through a frosted window, if she saw all of that, Wren would not be able to keep her voice level when she answered. And right now, a level voice was the only thing she had left. "Yes," Wren said. "I understand." Karen Aldrich slid a yellow carbon copy across the desk without ceremony. Wren took it. The paper felt thin in her hands, nearly weightless, which seemed wrong for something that carried so much consequence. 30 days, Mrs. Calloway. That's the best I can do." Wren folded the paper in half and tucked it into the pocket of her coat. She stood up. She picked up her purse, which had a broken strap held together with a safety pin. She walked across the linoleum floor to where Della was sitting, and she held out her hand, and Della took it without speaking, without looking up from the bear, and together they walked out through the glass door and down the corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner, and out into the parking lot where the afternoon sun was pressing down on cracked asphalt with the indifferent weight of a September that did not care what happened to either of them. The car was parked near the far end of the lot, a 2011 Honda Civic dark gray one taillight held in place with tape. The back seat held 2 large garbage bags of clothing, a canvas tote of Della's school books, a small box of kitchen things, a pot, 2 bowls, a wooden spoon, and the arrangement of pillows and folded blankets that had been Della's sleeping space for the past 6 weeks. The trunk held what remained of their lives after the house, the furniture, the bank accounts, and the sense of an identifiable future had all been removed one by one like bricks pulled from a wall until the wall became a memory. Wren opened the back door. Della climbed in and curled herself into her corner between the pillows without being asked, the bear pressed against her chest, her eyes already somewhere else. Wren closed the door softly. She walked around to the driver's side and sat down behind the wheel. She did not start the engine. She sat there with both hands in her lap and stared at the concrete pillar directly in front of the car and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The thing you do when the alternative is falling apart in a parking lot in front of your child. 2 years ago, she had been teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary School in Carver, Ohio. Room 14. 22 students who called her Mrs. Calloway and drew pictures of her with yellow hair, even though her hair was brown, and who brought her apples in September and handmade cards in December, and some of whom, the ones who struggled with reading, had stayed after school 3 days a week so she could work with them one-on-one, because that was the kind of teacher she was. 2 years ago, she had lived in a house on Elm Terrace with a garden in the back where she grew tomatoes and basil, and 1 stubborn rose bush that bloomed every June, no matter what. She had a porch swing and a kitchen window that looked out over the yard, and a coffee maker that began its cycle automatically at 6:15 every morning, because that was when Owen got up for work. Owen. 6'1" broad shoulders, a laugh you could hear from 2 rooms away. A structural engineer who could look at a building and tell you within minutes where its weaknesses lived. Who drew horses for Della on any flat surface he could find, napkins, receipts, the margins of grocery lists, little sketches with flowing manes and proud heads. Because Della had loved horses since she was 3 years old and asked her father why they didn't have one. "We live in a house, not a ranch," he'd told her. "But I'll always draw you one." The scaffolding on the Mercer Street project had been improperly secured. That was the finding of the safety investigation, which was completed 11 months after Owen fell 32 feet and landed on a concrete subfloor. Improperly secured. 2 words that had dismantled everything. The hospital had done what it could. Wren would never say otherwise. But the bills had begun arriving before Owen was even out of the ICU, and they had kept coming long after he was gone, each one a new number with too many digits, each one another stone added to the weight she was carrying. The mortgage company had been patient for a time. Then it had not been patient. Then it had been a notice. Then it had been a process. Then it had been a date. She had sold what she could. She had borrowed what was available to borrow. She had applied for every form of assistance she could find and been turned down for most of them and accepted into a few programs that offered help that was real but not sufficient. The school district, facing its own budget crisis, had not renewed her contract for the coming year. She had looked for other work. She had found some, not enough. On the last morning in the house on Elm Terrace, Della had stood in the doorway of her empty bedroom, the rose-colored curtains, the only thing remaining, because Wren couldn't bring herself to take them down, and she had looked at the bare walls where her drawings used to hang, and she had not said anything. She had taken her bear from the floor and tucked it under her arm. She had walked down the stairs and gotten into the car. That had been 6 weeks ago. In those 6 weeks, Wren had driven to 3 different cities, looking for work in affordable housing and finding neither in the combination she needed. She had called the shelter network so many times that certain coordinators recognized her voice. The beds were always full by the time she reached the front of the list. She had learned the locations of every gas station bathroom in a 40-mile radius that had hot water and didn't require a key. She had learned to make instant noodles in a foam cup with water from a convenience store coffee station. She had learned that a Honda Civic, when packed with intention, could be a sleeping space for 2 people, though not a comfortable one. And she had watched Della disappear. Not physically. Della ate when food was offered. She drank water. She slept. She followed instructions when Wren gave them. But the child who had run across the backyard, calling for fireflies on summer evenings, who had sung to herself while coloring at the kitchen table, who had once climbed into bed with Wren at 3 in the morning because she dreamed about a red balloon and couldn't figure out where it had gone, that child had gone somewhere inside herself on the day they stood at Owen's grave and listened to a minister speak about a man none of them knew, and she had not come back out. The last full sentence Della had spoken was at the cemetery. She had looked at this casket and said, "Daddy doesn't like the dark." And then she had taken Wren's hand and been quiet. 4 months of quiet, 30 days. Wren looked at the concrete pillar. The number arranged itself in her mind the way large numbers do when they represent something the mind doesn't want to hold. It looks small on paper. 32 syllables, a modest number. But it was not modest. It was a door with a lock on it, and on the other side of that door was her daughter, and the time available to find the key was running out. She started the engine and drove. She drove to the gas station on Merchant Street, the one with the bathroom in the back that had a lock on the inside and enough hot water for a real wash. She filled a foam cup from the dispenser near the coffee station and added the packet of instant noodles she'd bought 3 days ago and saved. She brought it out to the car and handed it to Della through the window without a word. Della ate without being asked. Small things. Wren had learned to count small things. She was sitting on the curb outside the car, watching the traffic move along Merchant Street in the late afternoon light, thinking about nothing and everything simultaneously in the way that exhausted people think when her phone buzzed in her pocket. An unknown number. Kansas area code. She almost let it go. The reflex to ignore unknown numbers had become as automatic as breathing. Over the past year. Every number she didn't recognize had been, without exception, a collector of some kind, a representative of some institution that wanted something she didn't have. She had learned the particular texture of those conversations, The scripted sympathy that evaporated the moment you confirmed you had no payment to offer, and she had no capacity left for that texture. But something made her swipe the screen. Some instinct she couldn't have named. A tiredness perhaps beyond the reach of ordinary caution. Mrs. Wren Calloway. The voice was elderly female with a precision to it that reminded Wren of her grandmother's generation, people who had learned to speak with care because words in their experience had real consequences. "Who's asking?" Wren said. "My name is Harriet Voss. I'm an attorney practicing in Harlan, Kansas. I'm calling regarding the estate of August Merritt." Wren said nothing. "I understand this may come as a surprise, Mrs. Calloway. I'll ask you to bear with me for a few minutes, because what I have to tell you is both unusual and I believe genuinely important to your situation." The pause that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the pause of someone who understood the weight of what they were about to say and had decided not to rush it. "August Merritt was your great-grandfather on your father's side," Harriet Voss said. "He was born in 1902 in Harlan County and lived there his entire life. He passed away in 1995 at the age of 93. In his will, he left the entirety of his estate to his direct lineal heir. That heir, after considerable research over many years, has been identified as you." Wren looked at the traffic moving along Merchant Street, a pickup truck, a minivan, a woman on a bicycle with a child seat on the back, the ordinary procession of the world going about its business. "What does the estate consist of?" she asked. 45 acres of land in Harlan County," Harriet said. "A farmhouse, a barn, and several outbuildings. There is, I should tell you up front, a significant complication. The property carries back taxes of approximately $48,000 accumulated over many years of disputed ownership. There is a development company called Summit Land Group that has been attempting to acquire the property for nearly a decade. They've made an offer that would cover the tax liability entirely and leave you with a remaining sum of $10,000. $10,000. The number moved through Wren's mind like a light through a dark room, briefly illuminating things: first and last month's rent, groceries, a few weeks of breathing space, a real door to close at night instead of a car window. "There's a condition," Harriet Voss continued. "There's always a condition with August Merritt. He was a man who believed in doing things precisely as he intended, and his will reflects that." "What kind of condition?" "There is a storm cellar on the property. It has been sealed since 1936. August specified in his will that before any sale or transfer of the property can occur, and before the terms of the estate can be executed in full, the cellar must be opened personally by the direct heir. Those are the exact words in the document. Personally opened, with your own hands. No one else may do it for you or in your place." Wren watched a sparrow land on the concrete near her foot, look around with sharp, bright eyes, and fly away. "Why?" she asked. "I don't know," Harriet said. "The will doesn't explain." August was a man who kept his own counsel. "What I can tell you is that the condition is legally binding, that it has prevented any resolution of this estate for nearly 30 years, and that every previous attempt to work around it has failed." "How long has this been waiting?" "Since 1995. The estate was identified and opened at the time of August's death, but tracing the direct lineage took many years. Your father's branch of the family had become quite distant from Harlan County. When we finally located you, your circumstances were—" Harriet paused, choosing her word, "complicated." Wren didn't ask what that meant. She knew what it meant. It meant the world had been watching her drown and had waited until she had nearly gone under before throwing anything. "How far is Harlan from where I am?" "About 13 hours by road from Carver. 2 days if you drive conservatively." Wren looked at the car, at Della in the back seat, a small shape among pillows, the bear pressed to her chest. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course," Harriet said, "but I should tell you, and I say this not to pressure you, but because I believe you deserve the full picture." Summit Land Group is not patient. Their representative has been in contact with my office regularly. If you don't move on this within a reasonable window, they will pursue other legal avenues. They have resources, and they are not inclined to wait indefinitely." After she hung up, Wren sat on the curb for a long time. She thought about 30 days. She thought about $48,000 in back taxes and $10,000 left over. She thought about a cellar sealed since 1936 and an old man who had waited 3 decades for someone to come and open it. She thought about what Harriet Voss's voice had sounded like, careful and honest, and neither hopeful nor despairing, the voice of a woman who had seen enough of the world to report it accurately. She thought about Owen, who had drawn horses on napkins. She thought about Della. She got up off the curb, walked to the driver's door, and got in. 2 days later, they were on the road. The first day was all Ohio, and then Indiana, and then the flat margin of Illinois, the landscape shifting gradually from the familiar to the unfamiliar, in the way that long drives do imperceptibly at first, and then with sudden clarity, as if the world has turned a page. Wren drove steadily, taking the smaller routes where gas was cheaper, stopping at rest areas to use the bathrooms and let Della stretch. She had $43 in Barshi and a debit card with 112 on it, and a cooler in the back and with peanut butter and crackers and 2 apples and a box of cereal that she and Della had been working through for 3 days. Della sat in the back and looked out the window. Wren watched her in the rearview mirror at intervals, the way her eyes moved across the passing landscape, following the distant tree lines and the water towers in the shapes of farmhouses set back from the road. There was something in the way she watched, not the vacant staring of the past 4 months, something more like attention, as if the moving world outside the glass was registering in a way that the stationary world had not. Wren did not speak to her about it. She had learned painfully that drawing attention to Della's attention could collapse it. She watched and said nothing and drove. The second day was all Kansas. There is a particular quality to the Kansas landscape that people who have not seen it sometimes fail to understand from descriptions alone. They hear flat and they imagine featureless, and that is wrong. The Kansas plains are not featureless. They have a scale to them that works on the eye and the mind differently than hills or coastline or forest, a horizontal grandeur that stretches the peripheral vision to its limit and places the sky in an entirely different relationship to the earth than most people are accustomed to. The grass in September is the color of old gold, faded and honest, moving in waves under the wind like a slow exhalation. The sky above it is the blue of deep water, enormous, unhurried. Wren had never been to Kansas. She had not known her father's family. Her father himself had been a quiet man who did not discuss where he came from, and he had died when Wren was 19 from a heart condition that announced itself without preamble one Tuesday morning. She knew his name, she knew the basic outline of his life, but she did not know his origins, and he had not offered them. And now a lawyer she had never met had called her from a small town. She'd had to look up on a map to tell her that somewhere in all of this golden space an old man had been building and waiting and holding her name in a letter for 30 years. She thought about that, what kind of faith that required, what kind of patience. To build something and seal it and write a name on an envelope and trust that eventually, across whatever distance and whatever time, the right hands would come to open it. Harlan was small in the way of towns that have been exactly what they are for a long time without apology. A main street with a hardware store, and a diner with a hand-lettered sign, and a feed store with grain bags stacked on the sidewalk, and a pharmacy with an old-fashioned awning. The kind of place where the grocery store still knew most of its customers by name, and the high school football team's record was tracked with genuine civic attention. Everything had the look of things that had been used for real purposes for a long time, worn in the way of tools rather than decoration. Harriet Voss's office was above the pharmacy, up a narrow staircase with a wooden banister that was smooth from decades of hands. The staircase smelled like old wood and lemon oil, and the particular dry paper scent of a place where documents lived. Harriet herself was at the top of the stairs. She was a tall woman in her early 70s, silver-haired, with a posture that suggested a person who had not allowed the world to bend her forward. She wore a dark blazer over a white blouse and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she extended her hand when Wren reached the landing with the steadiness of someone who understood that a handshake was a small act of acknowledgement that cost nothing and mattered more than most people remembered. "Mrs. Calloway, thank you for making the trip." Her office was tidy in the way that working offices are tidy, not showroom tidy, but organized tidy. Everything in a place that made sense to the person who used it. Bookshelves lined 2 walls. A window looked out over Main Street, the afternoon light coming through it at a long September angle. There was a glass dish of hard candies on the corner of the desk. Harriet looked at Della with the same steady directness she used for everything else, no performance of sweetness, but no indifference either, and she gestured toward the candy dish with a small tilt of her head. Della looked at the dish for a moment, then reached out and took a butterscotch without speaking. Harriet settled into her chair. She let a beat pass. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "I've been managing this estate for 22 years since I took over Mr. Aldrich's practice in 2001. I've seen 3 other individuals come through this office claiming connection to August Merritt's estate. One of them spent 2 weeks on those cellar doors and never made progress. 2 others turned back before they started. And in all that time, Summit Land Group has been circling this property like something that knows it can wait." She folded her hands on the desk. "Their representative will be here shortly. I want you to know that before you meet him, because he will be prepared, and I want you to be prepared as well." "What's his name?" Wren asked. "Preston Aldgate. He's been with Summit Land Group for about 15 years. He's good at what he does, which is applying steady, polite, persistent pressure until people make decisions they might not otherwise make. He'll be kind to you. He'll seem reasonable. He'll make numbers sound like solutions." Harriet's eyes were steady behind her reading glasses. "Just remember that the numbers he's offering are a fraction of what that land is likely worth to his company. There's a geological survey from 2018 suggesting the Merritt property sits directly above a significant aquifer system. Clean water rights in this part of Kansas are not a small thing. Summit has been buying up properties along the county line for a decade. They want yours because of what's under the ground, not because of what's on it." Wren thought about that, about what sits beneath the surface unseen and valuable, while everyone argues about the broken roof and the sagging porch. "What can you tell me about August himself?" she asked. Harriet's expression shifted in a way that was not dramatic, but was legible, a small softening like light changing behind a window. "I never met him. He died 6 years before I took over the practice. But Mr. Aldrich left notes about him, personal observations accumulated over nearly 40 years of serving as his attorney. He wrote that August Merritt was the finest craftsman he'd ever known, a woodworker. He made furniture not for wealthy clients, but for ordinary people, tables, chairs, cradles, chests, things meant to be used and to last. He was known in Harlan for decades." She paused. "Mr. Aldrich also wrote that August was a man who had survived something that had broken most of the men around him, and that what he'd survived had either destroyed or refined a person's sense of what mattered. In August's case, it had refined it considerably." Before Wren could ask what that meant, the door opened. He was 50 years old and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had not been surprised by a room in a long time. Medium height, well built in the way of someone who managed his appearance with attention and intention. Polo shirt, khaki trousers, shoes that were clean in a way that suggested they were always clean. His hair was dark with gray at the temples, cut close. His smile appeared the instant his eyes found Wren, and it was wide and immediate and did not reach a single thing behind it. "You must be Mrs. Calloway." He crossed the room with his hand extended. "Preston Aldgate, Summit Land Group. I'm very glad you could make it out here." Wren shook his hand because refusing would have been a gesture, and gestures cost energy she didn't have. She watched his eyes make a circuit of the room in the first few seconds after entering it. Not conspicuously. He wasn't crude about it. But Wren had spent 2 years watching every room for exits and resources and threats, and she recognized the same reflex in someone else. Preston Aldgate was cataloging the state of her coat, the safety pin on her purse strap, the garbage bags visible through the car window in the street below. He was building a picture of her situation the same way she'd been building pictures of rooms. He was good at making it look like warmth. He sat down across from Harriet's desk without being invited and produced a folder from the leather briefcase he carried with the smooth efficiency of someone who had done this exact motion thousands of times. "I know Harriet has given you the background on the estate," he said. "I won't waste your time going over what you already know. What I want to do is make this as simple as possible for you, because I understand you're dealing with a lot right now, and simple is what you need." He opened the folder and laid 2 pages on the desk, turning them so they faced Wren. "We've increased our offer. Current back taxes are $48,000. We'll cover that in full. And we're prepared to pay you $15,000 on top of that, free and clear, no conditions, transferred to an account of your choosing within 48 hours of signing." He said the number the way a person sets down something heavy with care so it would land properly. "You could sign today," he said. "Be in a hotel tonight instead of." He let the pause do the work. "Wherever you've been. Enroll your daughter in a school here in Harlan or back in Ohio, whatever makes sense for your situation. Start fresh. That's a real thing I'm offering you, not a possibility, an outcome you can count on. Wren looked at the papers without picking them up. She looked at the figures on the first page and felt their pull, which was real and not shameful to feel. $15,000 was 3 months of rent in most places. It was groceries for a year. It was the distance between the car and a door. She felt Della shift in the plastic chair beside her, and she looked over. Della was watching Preston Aldgate with eyes that were not the eyes of a child who had withdrawn from the world. They were attentive and narrowed and 7 years old and somehow older than 7. "I want to see the land first," Wren said. Something moved across Preston's face. It was fast and it was carefully controlled, and it was gone before most people would have caught it, but Wren caught it. It was not surprise. It was the particular micro-expression of a man who had encountered this specific obstacle before and had prepared for it and did not enjoy encountering it regardless. "Of course," he said, "that's completely reasonable. I'd only caution you that the property is in serious disrepair. The house is structurally compromised. The roof has sections that are genuinely dangerous. And the land itself," he spread his hands in a gesture of gentle reasonableness, "it hasn't been maintained in 30 years. It's not what you'd imagine from the word estate." Then he leaned slightly forward. "I should also tell you something," he said. "Not to discourage you, but because I think you should know the history. That cellar has never been opened, not for lack of trying. Over the years, several people have attempted to force those doors. One man about 12 years ago spent 3 weeks working on them. He fell from a ladder trying to reach the upper hinges and broke 2 vertebrae. He was in the hospital for 6 weeks. He paused. People around here have stories about that cellar. Old stories about August Merritt sealing it up and telling no one why. About what might or might not be inside. Some people say he put a seal on it beyond what rust and tar can explain." He shook his head with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. "I'm not saying I believe in things like that, but I think you should go in with your eyes open. Some things get sealed for a reason, Mrs. Calloway. Some things are better left the way they are." Della had gone very still beside Wren. Wren could feel it without looking, the way a child becomes still when something in the room makes them want to be invisible. She reached out and put her hand over her daughter's, and Della's fingers closed around hers. "I'll see the land tomorrow," Wren said. "After that, I'll let you know where I stand." Preston held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Not the smoothly calibrated warmth of his pitch. Something harder and more complicated beneath it, a conviction, a sense of claim that went beyond professional interest. It was there for only a second before the practiced ease reasserted itself, but she had seen it. Whatever Preston Aldgate wanted from this property, it was not merely a transaction. He gathered his papers, closed, the folder stood up. The smile returned, reliable as a mechanism. "I'll look forward to hearing from you," he said. "My offer is on the table through the end of the month. After that, I can't guarantee the same terms." He shook Harriet's hand, nodded to Wren, glanced at Della with the brief acknowledgement of someone who had registered her presence without quite seeing her, and left. The door closed. The office was quiet. Harriet looked at Wren for a moment before speaking. "He knew, didn't he?" Wren said. Harriet nodded. "He knew the property better than anyone who hasn't lived there. He's been researching it for years. Has he tried to open the cellar himself? He can't. The will's condition is iron, only the direct heir. Any other attempt voids the estate and the property reverts to the county. He knows that. It's why he needs you." Wren looked out the window at the main street below at Harlan going about its late afternoon. A man carrying a bag from the hardware store. A woman talking to someone outside the feed store. The unhurried ordinariness of a place that had been itself for a long time. "Who's going to take me to the property?" she asked. Harriet picked up her phone. "His name is Silas Drummond," she said. "He's 72 years old and he's lived on the county road adjacent to the Merritt property for 40 years. He knew August better than anyone still living in Harlan. He'll be at your motel at 8 tomorrow morning." There was a pause. Then Harriet set the phone down and looked at Wren with the directness that was her natural mode. "I should tell you something about Silas," she said. "He doesn't waste words and he doesn't offer opinions unless he has something worth saying. But he has been waiting a long time for someone to come and do what you're here to do. He won't say that, but you should know it. That night, Ren and Della slept in the car in the motel parking lot because the motel rates were $38 and she couldn't justify it when the seat reclined and the night was not cold. She lay in the front seat and listened to her daughter breathing in the back and looked at the Kansas stars through the windshield. The stars in Kansas are different from the stars over a city. There are simply more of them. The sky out here had the depth of something that had never been competed with by streetlights and neon, and the accumulated electric glow of too many people in too small a space. It was the sky as it would have looked when August Merritt was young, when he was a craftsman with a wife and a son, in a future that felt fragile as glass when the world outside was collapsing and he was trying to figure out whether he had enough in him to hold. She fell asleep thinking about that, about what it meant to hold. Silas Drummond was leaning against a truck when she came out at 7:55 the next morning. He was a tall man, gone lean with age, 72 years worn into his face and hands, the way weather works on good wood, not degrading it, but giving it character. His truck was a 1998 Ford, the kind of truck that had earned its dents. He wore a canvas jacket over a work shirt and boots that had seen serious use. And when Wren walked out with Della beside her, he looked at them both with eyes the color of creek water, in autumn unhurried and clear. He didn't extend a hand, he just nodded. "Ready when you are," he said. The drive took 20 minutes on paved road, then 10 on gravel, then a dirt track through tall grass that was barely 2 ruts in the earth. Silas drove with the ease of someone who had made this trip countless times, and he did not speak, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man who understood that some things were better received without a preamble. Then Wren saw the house. It appeared at the end of the track the way things appear in certain kinds of light, not all at once, but in pieces assembled by the eye as they came into focus. First, the roofline uneven against the sky, dipping in the center, like something that had been carrying a weight for a long time. Then the walls' white paint peeled away in long strips to reveal the gray wood beneath silver and weathered as driftwood. The porch sagged on the left side where a post had given way. Several windows were boarded. The yard, if you could call it that, was chest-high grass with wildflowers moving in it. The barn to the east had lost half its roof. The remaining half stood like a remnant of a larger thing, but the frame of the house was straight. That was the first thing Wren registered, moving beneath the evidence of 30 years of abandonment. The bones of the place were sound. The walls met at right angles. The corners held. Someone had built this to last, and it had lasted even through everything that had been allowed to happen to it. She felt Della stiffen beside her in the back seat. She turned to look at her daughter, and she saw something that made her breath stop. Della's face was pressed against the window glass. Her eyes were open and full of something that was not the careful blankness of the past 4 months. It was alive, alert, the expression of a child who has seen something that has reached through whatever wall she had put between herself and the world and touched the part of her that was still there, still waiting. Then Della spoke. "Mama," one word, just that one word. But it came out of her daughter's mouth with a realness that filled the cab of the truck the way sound fills a room that has been silent completely, suddenly changing the nature of everything in it. Wren didn't move. She was afraid to move. "Mama," Della said again, "there's a yard." Her voice was small and careful, like something she was testing. "A yard where I can run." Silas Drummond brought the truck to a stop and cut the engine. He didn't turn around. He sat facing forward, both hands on the wheel, and after a moment, he said in a voice that was low and rough and completely steady, "That's the first time I've heard her talk." "It's the first time in a while," Wren said. She did not trust herself to say more than that. They got out of the truck and walked through the tall grass toward the house. Wren held Della's hand and Della held the bear, and for 100 yards neither of them spoke. The grass came up to Wren's waist in places and was full of grasshoppers that sprang out ahead of them like sparks, and there were yellow wildflowers among the grass that Della looked at as she walked. The property opened up around them as they moved through it. 45 acres. To the north, a line of old oaks on a ridge, their crowns wide and permanent in the September skyttery. To the east, past the collapsed barn, a line of silver that was a creek catching the morning light. The land itself was not spectacular in any way that a photograph would capture, but standing in it, moving through it, Wren understood something that she hadn't expected. It had a weight to it, a solidity, like standing on something that had been here before you and would be here after, and did not particularly care either way. which was not indifference but something more like permanence. "Where's the cellar?" she asked. Silas pointed toward a low rise about 50 yards from the house. "Over there." They walked toward it through the grass and the wildflowers and the grasshoppers. From a distance, the cellar doors looked like part of the earth, a mound with something dark set into it, at an angle half hidden by years of overgrowth. As they got closer, the shape resolved into something deliberate and substantial. Two large steel doors set at roughly 30 degrees into the slope of the rise, constructed of plate steel that had rusted over 9 decades to a deep, angry orange, the color of old blood or iron ore fresh from the ground. But the rust was not the first thing Wren noticed. The first thing she noticed was what had been done in addition to the rust. Every seam between the two doors had been filled with a thick black substance that had hardened to something between tar and resin, the kind of seal that did not happen by accident or neglect, but by sustained intentional effort. And across both doors, three heavy iron bands had been bolted at intervals. The bolts themselves long since fused to the bands and the bands to the doors by decades of corrosion, until the whole assembly had become something that was no longer exactly metal and rust and sealant, but a unified massive refusal. It did not look like a storm cellar. Storm cellars were functional things built for access for the practical need to get underground quickly when the sky turned green. This looked like something that had been made deliberately inaccessible, sealed by someone who wanted to make absolutely sure that time alone would not open it, that casual curiosity or routine maintenance or the normal entropy of things would not gradually undo what they had done. This looked like a decision expressed in iron and tar and 60 pounds of steel. Silas came to stand beside her. "Your great-grandfather sealed this himself," he said, "spring of 1936. Neighbors helped him pour the tar into the seams, but nobody knew why. He never said. He just worked until it was done, and then he walked back to the house and didn't speak about it again." He looked at the doors with an expression that was not quite readable. There was something in it that Wren would have called respect if she had been pressed to name it. Respect for a person who had kept a secret so thoroughly and so long that the secret had outlived everyone who might have thought they had a right to know it. "People around here spent years wondering," Silas said. "Some thought he'd sealed something embarrassing. Some thought it was a treasure. Some thought he'd lost his mind during the hard years and done it for reasons nobody could understand from the outside." He paused. "I always thought it was simpler than any of that. I always thought he sealed it because he was waiting for something and he didn't want anyone opening it before the right time." He looked at Wren. "Now you're here. So I guess it's the right time." Della had moved around the side of the mound while they talked the way children do when they are in a space that interests them, following the perimeter, taking inventory with their bodies rather than their eyes. Wren watched her without appearing to watch the old reflex of the parent who monitors at the edge of vision. Della stopped near the base of the rise. She bent down and pushed aside a clump of tall grass, and then she stood up and looked at her mother. "Mama," she said, "come look." Wren crossed to where her daughter was standing. Half hidden in the weeds at the edge of the rise, almost reclaimed by the grass that had grown over and around it over decades, was a flat stone roughly the size of a large book. It was flush with the earth on three sides as if it had been placed there with care, and then left to sink gradually into the ground over the years. Wren knelt and pushed the grass aside and brushed the dirt from the surface of the stone with the side of her hand. The letters had been carved with something fine, a chisel probably, or a good knife worked with patience and precision. They were worn by the years, but legible the way things carved in stone remain legible long after the same words written on paper have turned to nothing. She read them twice before she fully understood them. "For the one who comes home, M. 1936, she stayed on her knees for a moment longer than she needed to. The grass moved around her in the wind, and above her, the Kansas sky was the same blue it had been when August Merritt carved those letters 87 years ago, looking at this stone, thinking about whoever would eventually find it, whoever would eventually come home." Silas stood back at a distance, giving her the space that something like this required. Della crouched beside Wren and looked at the letters with an expression that was purely attentive, purely present the face of a child who is taking something seriously. "What does AM mean?" Della asked. "August," Merritt Wren said. "He was my great-grandfather. He built this place." Della looked at the cellar doors, and then at the stone, and then at the house standing in its tall grass with its straight bones and its peeling paint. "Why did he seal it up?" she asked. Wren sat back on her heels and looked at the sealed doors. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I think he had a good reason." Della considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old encountering a real mystery for the first time. Then she stood up and held out her hand, and Wren took it, and they stood there together in the September light on the Kansas plain, looking at a door that had been waiting nearly a century for someone to come and open it. Somewhere behind them, across the field, the old oaks on the ridge moved in the wind, their crowns turning slowly, the sound of their leaves, the sound of the land breathing steady and unhurried. The way it had breathed before any of them were born, and the way it would breathe long after. And it occurred to Wren Calloway, standing in the grass with her daughter's hand in hers, and 29 days left to find a home, that she had been brought here by necessity, in desperation, and a phone call she almost hadn't answered. But standing here with the stone at her feet, and the sealed doors before her, and the straight bones of the old house behind her, she did not feel the way necessity and desperation usually made her feel. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first tool Silas Drummond put in her hands was the sledgehammer. It was a 12-pound head on a hickory handle, the handle worn smooth at the grip from decades of use, the head dark with old rust along the flat faces and clean at the striking edge where the metal had been kept true. He set it down in the bed of his truck the morning after Wren first saw the property alongside a cold chisel, two pry bars of different lengths, a bolt cutter with 18-inch handles, and a canvas roll of smaller tools whose specific purposes she did not yet know. He had also brought a paper bag with 2 thermoses of coffee and a box of donuts from the diner on Main Street because he was a man who understood that work required fuel and that arriving at a job site without it was a form of disrespect for the work. He handed Wren one of the thermoses and looked at the cellar doors without expression. "The bands first," he said. "The bolt cutter won't get through them, too much corrosion fused into the metal. You'll need to break the bolts themselves." Cold chisel set against the shaft hammer driving it. 2 hits to set it, third hit to shear. Your arms will know it when you get the angle right. He demonstrated on the first bolt with the ease of someone explaining something simple, which for him it was. The chisel found the neck of the bolt, the hammer came down twice with unhurried precision to seat it, and the third blow sheared the bolt shaft cleanly. He handed her the hammer. She took it. The weight of it was different in her hand than she had expected, not just heavy, but purposeful, the way a good tool carries the accumulated intention of everyone who has used it correctly. She set the chisel against the next bolt, the way he'd shown her, angled slightly into the shaft. She raised the hammer and brought it down. The first blow glanced off. The chisel skidded sideways and rang against the door plate, and her arm absorbed a jarring vibration that ran all the way to her shoulder socket. Silas said nothing. He handed her the chisel back and waited. She set it again. This time she kept her wrist locked and drove from the elbow. The first blow seated it. The second seated it deeper. The third sheared the shaft. "Good," Silas said. "That's it." That was the most instruction he offered that first morning, and she found to her own surprise that it was enough. There was something in the work itself that taught her what she needed, the way the metal spoke through the handle of the hammer. The way her body learned by repetition what her mind couldn't have calculated, the way each successful break clarified the next one. She worked steadily through the morning, moving from bolt to bolt along the iron bands, and when the sun was directly overhead, she had broken 14 of the 22 bolts on the first band. Her hands were burning. She did not stop. Della had settled herself on a flat rock about 30 yards from the cellar, raised the bear in her lap, watching her mother work with an expression of complete attention. Around her, the September grass moved in the wind, and the grasshoppers conducted their business. And twice a red-tailed hawk made a long, slow circle overhead that Della tracked from beginning to end with her eyes turned upward. After lunch, peanut butter crackers from the cooler and the second thermos of coffee, Silas showed Wren how to use the pry bar to work at the bands themselves once the bolts were sheared, leveraging the metal away from the door plate in sections, bending it back. The iron was old enough that it had become brittle in places, and the brittle places surrendered with a sound like a branch breaking sharp and final. By the time the light began to flatten toward evening, the first band was off. Wren looked at her hands. The palms were red and tender in a way that had not yet fully registered as pain but would. She could see the topography of blisters forming beneath the skin along the base of her fingers where the hammer handle had worked against her grip. She closed her hands and opened them and looked at the second band. "Tomorrow," Silas said, It's not going anywhere. He said it without condescension as a statement of fact because it was. He drove her and Della back to the motel and helped Ren carry the tools into the room. And at the door he paused and reached into the pocket of his canvas jacket and produced a small tin of salve that smelled of beeswax and something herbal. For the hands, he said, put it on before you sleep. It doesn't fix the blisters, but it helps the skin stay together. He left. Ren sat on the edge of the bed and spread the salve on her palms and felt the immediate modest relief of it, and then lay back and stared at the water stain on the ceiling and was asleep in less than 3 minutes. The second day the blisters broke. She had known they would. She had wrapped her hands that morning with strips cut from an old cotton t-shirt before she picked up the hammer, and the cloth helped but did not prevent the inevitable. And by mid-morning the wrapping was damp and the skin beneath it raw, and she drove the hammer without pausing because there were 19 days left and 2 bands still on the doors, and the tar in the seams hadn't been touched yet, and the thought of Della in that orange plastic chair in Karen Aldrich's office was a more effective painkiller than anything she could have taken. The second band came off in the late afternoon. She didn't celebrate. She moved the tools to the third band and began. Della had started moving during the second day. Not far and not fast, but moving. Walking the perimeter of the rise, then drifting out into the tall grass in a slowly widening radius, turning back occasionally to locate her mother, and then turning out again. She collected things. Ren could see her bending and picking up items she found interesting: a smooth stone, a dried seed head, the shed shell of a cicada. She arranged them on her flat rock in configurations that had some internal logic Ren couldn't read from a distance. She was not speaking much, but she was not the still interior, absent version of herself that had occupied the car for 6 weeks. She was doing what children do when they are given space they have not had. She was exploring the boundaries of it carefully at first, and then with growing assurance. On the morning of the third day, Opal Strickland arrived in a blue pickup truck. She was 66, broad-shouldered, with silver-streaked hair cut practically short, and a face that wore its years the way working land wears them, not reluctantly, but honestly, as evidence of duration rather than decline. She ran the general store on the corner of First and Merchant in Harlan, which she had run for 31 years since taking it over from her father, and she drove out to the Merritt property with a covered casserole dish on the passenger seat and a mason jar of lemonade on the floor, and the unhurried purposefulness of someone doing a thing that needed doing. She set the casserole dish on the tailgate of Silas's truck and looked at Ren, who had just set down the hammer and was unwrapping her hands. Opal Strickland, she said, I've known about this property since I was a girl, and I figured the least I could do was bring you a decent meal while you work on it. She looked at Ren's hands without comment, then at the progress on the cellar doors, then at Della, who had come over when the truck arrived and was standing at the edge of the situation with the careful positioning of a child who wants to observe without committing to participation. Opal reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a small pack of saltine crackers, the individual serving kind, and held them out toward Della without making a production of it, the way you offer something to a child who might bolt if the gesture is too deliberate. Della took them. August Merritt came to my father's store every week for as long as I can remember, Opal said, addressing both Ren and Silas and the general air equally. I was maybe 5 or 6 the first time I was aware of him as a person rather than just a figure who appeared. Big hands, quiet voice, always had a specific list, never bought anything he didn't need. She paused. One winter, the wheel on our shopping cart was broken and wobbled so badly my mother couldn't steer it straight to save her life. August came in on a Tuesday, saw the problem, went out to his truck, came back with a wrench and had it fixed in 10 minutes. My father tried to give him money for his trouble. August wouldn't take a cent, said neighbors look after neighbors, and that was the end of that discussion. She looked at the cellar doors. He used to say there were 2 kinds of people, she said, people who took from a place and people who gave to it. He always said Harlan had been good to him, and he intended to be good to Harlan in return. He kept that intention for 60 years, far as I ever saw. She picked up the casserole dish and handed it to Ren. Chicken and rice, she said, feeds 4 comfortably or too well. There's a fork in there under the lid. She looked at Della again. You like chicken and rice? Della looked at the dish, then at Opal and said yes. Good, Opal said, as if the matter were settled. She got back in her truck. I'll bring something Thursday. She drove away down the dirt track with the composed efficiency of someone whose time had value. Ren looked at Silas. He shrugged with one shoulder, which was his version of saying something obvious. That's Harlan, he said. The days accumulated, the way hard work days do, each one feeling endless in the middle and compressed in retrospect. The progress real, but always less than you'd hoped and more than you'd feared. The third band came off on day 4. The seams were next, the hardest part, the tar that August had worked into every gap with methodical thoroughness 87 years ago. Wren stood at the doors in the late afternoon light of the 4th day and ran her fingers along the black substance in the seams and thought about the hands that had put it there. The hands of a 34-year-old man in the spring of 1936, in the worst economic crisis the country had experienced in living memory, doing something that most people watching him would have found inexplicable or eccentric or a sign of a mind under too much strain. Sealing a door in the earth with the care you would use to seal something worth protecting. What did he think about while he worked? What did he hope for? Did he genuinely believe, that what he was doing would matter to someone he'd never meet? She picked up the hammer and went back to work. On the 5th day, Preston Allgate drove up in his black sedan. She heard the car before she saw it, the sound of tires on gravel giving way to the softer sound of a well-maintained engine moving through tall grass. And she knew the sound of that particular car before it came into view, the way you know certain sounds that carry meaning. She set down the chisel and stood up straight and rotated her shoulders, which had developed a deep, sustained ache from 4 days of hammer work, and she waited. He got out looking precisely as he had in Harriet's office. Polo shirt, clean shoes, the practiced ease of a man who had never in any landscape appeared out of place. He stood at the edge of the rise and looked at the progress on the doors with an expression that moved too quickly through something approaching admiration before settling into its customary calculation. You've made real progress, he said. Wren didn't respond. He came closer. He had his hands in his pockets, and he walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided before arriving how the conversation was going to end. Silas was working on the near side of the barn, visible at a distance, not looking over. I have some new information for you, Preston said. News that changes the picture somewhat. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, which he held with the two-handed care of something important. The county assessor completed a property value review this week. He opened the document and looked at it with what appeared to be genuine regret. Based on updated valuations for properties in this section of the county, they've revised the tax liability upward. An additional $12,000 is now due within 21 days. He looked up. That brings the total to $60,000. Wren looked at him. $60,000 is not a number a person with your current financial situation can address through ordinary means, he said, and there was no cruelty in his voice, just the flat delivery of something he considered a fact. But I want to be clear, my offer still stands. We cover the full $60,000 plus $15,000 to you free and clear. All you have to do is sign. You drove out here to tell me the taxes went up, Wren said. I drove out here because I think you deserve to understand your full situation before you invest any more of yourself in this. Wren looked at the cellar doors, 4 days of work on them, her hands raw under the wrappings. The third band gone, the seams just starting to yield. She thought about the number, 60,000. The way large numbers worked on the mind, when you had nothing, they became not just the amounts they described, but the embodiment of impossibility, the concrete shape of the distance between where you were and anywhere else. She looked at Della, who was standing near her flat rock at a distance, watching Preston Allgate with the same narrow-eyed attention she'd offered him in Harriet's office. There's something else, Preston said. He folded the document and put it back in his pocket and produced a different one. This one, a legal envelope, cream-colored Summit Land Group letterhead on the return address. I've been retained by a man named Carl Briggs. He lives in Wichita. He's 64 years old, and he has documentation suggesting that his grandmother was the illegitimate daughter of Malcolm Merritt August's brother. Malcolm died in 1943, but he left a child, according to Carl's records, a child who was placed for adoption and whose descendants include Carl himself. He held out the envelope. If that lineage can be established, Carl has a legal claim to a portion of the Merritt estate, including whatever is found in that cellar. We would be filing suit to establish that claim within 21 days. Wren didn't take the envelope. A suit like that could take years, Preston continued. Years of legal proceedings, depositions, court costs. You don't have the resources for a protracted legal battle, And I think you know that. The sensible path, the path that gets you out of this situation cleanly and quickly, is to settle now, today. He set the envelope on the edge of the pry bar that was leaning against the cellar doors. Think about your daughter, he said. Not about the principle of the thing, not about what's behind those doors, about what she needs practically and concretely. What she needs is stability and a real home, and I'm offering you the fastest route to both. He waited. Wren picked up the pry bar, which displaced the envelope, and sent it into the grass. She turned to the seam between the cellar doors and put the flat edge of the bar against it. "Get off my land," she said. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Not the silence of someone who didn't have a response, but the silence of someone who had not expected to need one yet. Wren felt it without looking back. Then Preston said, 21 days, Mrs. Calloway. She heard his footsteps moving back through the grass toward his car. She heard the door open and close. She heard the engine. She drove the pry bar harder into the seam and felt the tar begin to give just slightly at one edge, the first yielding of something that had held for nearly 90 years. The car drove away. She worked for another hour without speaking. Behind her, Della came across the grass and sat down near the base of the cellar rise, close enough to be present, far enough to be out of the way, and picked up a stick and began drawing something in the patch of bare earth near the stone with the carved letters. Wren didn't look to see what she was drawing, but she could hear the stoic moving, and that was enough. Silas came over from the barn when the car had been gone long enough to be certain. He looked at the disturbed soil where the envelope had landed, and at the progress on the seam, and at Wren's face, reading all three with equal attention. "Carl Briggs," Wren said. Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but occupied some of the same territory. He say, "Malcolm had an illegitimate daughter. He had documentation." Silas was quiet for a moment. He picked up a chisel and turned it in his hands. "Malcolm Merritt died at the Hurtgen Forest in November of 1944, he said. He was 19 years old and he'd been in Europe for 4 months. He didn't have any children, legitimate or otherwise. He never had a girl he was serious about, never wrote home about anyone, and he was barely old enough to have the opportunity. August knew that. More importantly, August made sure there was a record of it. He looked at the envelope in the grass. Preston's father ran the same play in 1991. Different name, same story. August was still alive then. He showed him the door. Left an impression from what I understand. He drove out here 30 years ago to try this. His father did. Preston would have been in his 20s, but he grew up knowing about this property, knowing his father had tried and failed. He looked at Wren. "I've been watching Preston Allgate circle this land for 9 years. He knows every inch of the file history. He knows every previous attempt to contest the estate. And now you're making progress on those doors, which is the one thing he never counted on anyone actually doing, and it's frightening him into mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "Bringing Carl Briggs into it. The documentation won't hold. Harriet will take it apart. He knows that too. He's not trying to win in court. He's trying to make the court sound expensive enough that you'll take the money instead." Wren looked at the seam, at the small section of yielding tar she'd managed at one edge. "He said 60,000 in taxes now," she said. Silas looked at her steadily. "Call Harriet," he said, "this evening. Don't let that number sit in your head overnight without verification." She called Harriet from the motel room that evening while Della slept, and Harriet made 3 calls of her own and called back within the hour. The taxes had been reassessed upwards, she said, but by 7,000, not 12. The county assessor's office had no record of a 21-day emergency collection notice. What Preston had shown her was technically accurate in its components, but constructed to sound more catastrophic than it was. "Exactly what I expected him to do," Harriet said. "He's a careful man. He doesn't lie outright. He assembles truths into shapes that look like something they aren't." "What about Carl Briggs?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "I'd want to look at the documentation he claims to have," she said. "But I can tell you that the 1982 letter August gave to Silas addresses this exact scenario. He anticipated it apparently because it wasn't the first time someone had tried it. The letter is detailed and specific about Malcolm's line of descent. If Preston files suit, we file the letter. It won't take long for a judge to see what's happening." Wren sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the tools in the corner of the room, the hammer and the chisels and the pry bars leaning against the wall, the tools that had blistered and broken her hands and that she would pick up again in the morning. She thought about $60,000. She thought about 21 days, which was not actually 21 days, but 17 because 4 had already passed. She thought about August Merritt in the spring of 1936 with a bank coming for his land and a son too young to understand, and a wife who took his hand in the dark and told him his hands could still make things, choosing not to run, choosing to go underground and build. She thought about what kind of woman had shared that choice with him, what it took to say, yes, this is the way we go down instead of away. We hold on in the dark and trust the light will come. Wren put the phone down and lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling. 17 days, she said to herself. Then she closed her eyes. Day 7, day 8, day 9. The seams were the hardest part. The tar had achieved in 87 years something close to the hardness of stone. Not the hardness of a thing that had dried, but the hardness of a thing that had compressed and cured and become something different from what it had started as. Wren worked at it with the cold chisel and a shorter-handled hammer that Silas brought from his workshop, better for the close detail work of following the seam, and she learned the difference between tar that had surface-hardened and would chip away and tar that had cured all the way through and required a different approach. She learned to read the material by sound. A sharp, clean ring when the chisel hit the hard-cured sections. A duller, denser sound when it was working at something that would give. She learned to favor the duller sound to find it and follow it the way you follow a vein in rock. Her arms developed a new kind of pain on day 7. Not the acute pain of blisters, but a deeper, sustained ache in the muscles of her forearms and shoulders that was there when she woke in the morning and present throughout the day, and there when she lay down at night. She stopped noticing it by day 8. It became the baseline, the new normal, the body's adjustment to a new reality, which was something she had some experience with. Della brought her wildflowers on day 8, walked over from whatever she'd been doing in the grass, and set a small bunch of them on the flat stone near the carved letters without comment and walked back. Wren looked at them, yellow and purple, prairie flowers. She didn't know the names of their stems, a little crushed from being carried. She left them there. By evening, they'd wilted, but they stayed. Opal came back on Thursday as promised, and on the Thursday after that, and each time she brought food and stayed for an hour and talked mostly about August, but sometimes about Harlan, the way people talk about a place they've lived in long enough to understand its character. She talked about the way the town had changed and the ways it hadn't, about the families who'd stayed and the ones who'd left, about the difference between land that was farmed and land that was sold to people who didn't farm it. She told Wren about the summer August had built a wheelchair ramp for the widow of a farmer named Danette, who lived 4 miles down the county road and couldn't afford to hire a contractor. He'd shown up on a Monday morning and worked 4 days straight and taken nothing for it except 2 jars of the woman's apple preserves, which he brought home to Eleanor. He didn't make a show of it, Opal said. He didn't tell anybody. I only know because Mrs. Dunnett told my mother years later, and my mother told me. That was how he operated. He thought work spoke for itself, or it didn't speak at all. She looked at the cellar doors, at the progress Wren was making. He'd be glad, she said simply. Whatever's down there, whatever he was holding on to, he'd be glad it's you that's opening it. Preston came back twice more. Once on day 9 and once on day 11. Each time with new information, a new interpretation of the estate law, a new figure for some projected cost, a new configuration of the same essential offer. Each time Wren stopped work long enough to hear him out and sent him away. Each time he left with less of the prontest warmth and more of the thing underneath it, the conviction that had no good name, the sense of a man who had been deprived of something he had decided belonged to him. The second time on day 11, he stood at the edge of the rise and watched her work for a long moment before he spoke. You know, he said, I've done a great deal of research into this family, into your father's line, into August himself. And there are things I've learned that you might find. He paused, selecting the word complicating. She kept working. People around here don't talk about it much, but the story of how August Merritt reacquired this land in 1937 is not entirely straightforward. There are records that suggest certain representations were made in the transaction that were not entirely accurate. The man who sold the land back to him claimed afterward that he hadn't understood what he was signing. He looked at the back of Wren's head. Some people would call what August did a con. A good one, maybe. A clever one. But a con. Wren set the chisel against the seam and struck it once. He left when it became clear she had nothing to say. The 14th day arrived the way things do when you've been counting toward them suddenly as if the calendar had made a decision overnight. Wren was at the doors before 7 in the morning while the sky was still the deep blue of early day and the dew was still on the grass. She had been awake since 4:30, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of someone who is close to something, the way the body knows, before the mind does, that the end of a long effort is within reach. Silas arrived at 7:15 with coffee and nothing else. He understood that this was not a morning for food. The tar was almost completely cleared from the upper seam and 3/4 cleared from the lower. Two sections on the right side remained thick and stubborn, the hardest cured areas. Wren worked through the morning on them with the methodical patience of someone who had 14 days of practice now and no energy left for frustration. At 2 in the afternoon, Silas went to his truck and came back with a propane torch. He handed it to Wren and showed her the angle in the distance far enough not to warp the metal, close enough to soften the tar. The flame held steadily to let the heat conduct rather than blast. The difference between patience and force expressed in temperature. The torch changed everything. The hardened tar softened within 30 seconds of sustained heat, becoming something between a solid and a liquid, dark and glistening, and Wren followed behind the heat with the chisel, and the sections cleared in minutes that had resisted hours. By 4 in the afternoon, the seams were clear. She turned off the torch. The smell of hot tar and metal hung in the air, sharp and industrial, completely out of place in the prairie wind that moved across the property from the northwest, carrying the smell of grass and late summer earth. Two things that had nothing to do with each other, occupying the same space. She stood back and looked at the doors. 87 years of sealing. 22 bolts, 3 iron bands, a tar line that had hardened into something close to stone, and now it was done. The doors were free of everything that had been put on them to make them immovable. The hinges were still rusted. The metal was still old and heavy, but it could move. Silas stepped back to the edge of the rise. He had been helping her all day, and she hadn't needed to ask for any of it, and now he gave her the distance that this moment deserved without being asked for that either. "Ready," he said. She looked toward the house. Della had been on the porch for the past hour watching from a distance. Now she was walking through the grass toward the rise, her small figure moving through the gold and green of the late afternoon prairie with the bear tucked under her arm, and her eyes fixed on the cellar doors as if they were the only thing in the world. She came to stand beside Wren. She took her mother's hand. "I'm coming too," she said. It was not a question. Wren looked down at her daughter, at this child who had been silent for 4 months and who had spent 14 days in the Kansas sun, gradually remembering how to be present, how to collect things and arrange them, and watch the sky and bring wildflowers and exist in the world rather than alongside it from behind a pane of glass. "Okay, baby," she said. "We'll go together." Wren picked up the 2 longest pry bars and wedged the flat ends into the gap between the 2 doors at opposite points, as Silas had showed her to do. She put her weight on the near bar and felt Silas's hand come to the far one beside her, and they pressed down together. For a moment, nothing. Then the right door shuddered. A deep sound came from inside the hinges. Not the sharp sound of metal breaking, but a low, resonant groan. The sound of something that had been held in one position for so long that movement itself was a form of protest. The door rose an inch, 2 inches, the groan deepening and then shifting into a grinding as the hinges moved through their range of motion for the first time in nearly a century. Cool air came out of the gap. It came out with a kind of purpose, as if it had been waiting for the chance, rushing past the edges of the door into the warm September afternoon. And with it came the smell. Not the smell of a sealed underground space, which Wren had been half prepared for close air and mineral damp, and the chemical edge of materials slowly off-gassing in confinement. This was something different, something clean and complex. Cedar, linseed oil, the dry, particular scent of old, fine-grained wood in a controlled space. The smell of things made with intention and preserved with care. The smell of a workshop translated by time into something richer and more distilled, the essence of craft reduced by decades to its purest components. Della pressed closer to Wren's side. "What does it smell like?" she whispered. Wren looked at her. "Like something real," she said. She lifted the door fully open, the hinges complaining the whole way, and propped it with the pry bar. The second door opened more easily once the first was up, as if the two had been in conversation about it and had reached an agreement. The opening was dark. The steps were concrete steep, descending into earth. Silas handed Wren a flashlight from his jacket pocket without comment. She took it and clicked it on. The beam found the walls concrete smooth dry, and the steps 15 of them descending at a sharp angle, and below them a floor. Silas stepped back. "This is yours to find," he said. "I'll be here." Wren went first, testing each step before committing her weight. They were solid sound, the concrete poured with care. The walls curved slightly as she descended the flashlight, throwing moving shadows that resolved as her eyes adjusted to the depth. The air grew cooler with each step, and the smell grew stronger. Autumn and linseed oil, and time itself thick and layered and alive in a way that the air above ground was not. Della came down behind her one step at a time, holding the metal railing that ran down the right side of the stairway. Wren heard her small footsteps, measured and deliberate, and felt her daughter's presence behind her as a steady thing in the dark. At the bottom, the flashlight swept the room. It was not large, perhaps 15 feet by 10 feet concrete on all four walls, and the ceiling low enough that Wren could have touched it if she raised her hand. Everything was very dry. Whatever ventilation August had built into this place had maintained the environment through 9 decades of Kansas weather. The freeze and thaw, the summer heat, the humidity without a trace of the damp or mold that should by rights have been present. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair. Beside it, a small wooden table. The chair and table were well made, the proportions right, the joinery solid, nothing decorative but nothing mean either. The objects of a craftsman working without an audience for reasons of his own. On the table was a metal box, military issue, the kind carried as a footlocker, olive drab paint, mostly gone to bare metal latches, large and plain. It was not locked. That was all. Wren stood in the center of the room and turned slowly with the flashlight, confirming what she saw. No shelves, no additional furniture, no crates or containers, just the chair and the table, and the box, and the clean, dry smell of cedar that was coming from somewhere she couldn't yet identify. She set the flashlight on the table, pointing at the ceiling to diffuse the light, and she opened the metal box. Inside, resting on a bed of folded wool cloth, gray, slightly faded, still soft, were three things. A thick stack of envelopes bound with a length of brown string, a journal in a leather-covered dark brown, the leather dried and cracked at the spine, and a silver flask, the metal tarnished to a deep gunmetal finish, a monogram engraved on the face that she would read later as AM. She picked up the envelope on top of the stack. The handwriting on it was strong and unhurried, a confident cursive that had not been impeded by age, the practiced hand of someone who had written a great deal and learned through repetition to mean what they put down. The envelope was addressed to Wren Calloway. She read the name twice. Then she turned the envelope over in her hands, looking at it from different angles, as if the angle would explain it. Wren Calloway. Her name. In full. Written on an envelope that had been sealed in this box in a room behind a door that had been welded shut with tar and iron bands in 1936 by a man who died in 1995 when she was 5 years old, a child she had never met and who had never, to her knowledge, had any contact with her family in her lifetime. Her hands had gone very still. Mama, Della said from behind her. Wren. Della was standing against the wall near the chair, her head tilted slightly, the way she tilted it when something required additional consideration. "There's a line," she said. She pointed. "On that wall, behind the chair." Wren stepped around the table and raised the flashlight and looked at the wall. Della was indicating the far wall directly behind the chair, smooth concrete like the others. She almost didn't see it. It was subtle, the difference in texture so slight that it would have been invisible in the room's overhead light if there had been overhead light. But the flashlight held at an angle, threw a shadow into the faint vertical depression that ran from the floor to within a foot of the ceiling, a line perfectly straight, the width of a seam. She moved the light along the floor at the base of the wall and found the horizontal line that completed the rectangle. A door, set into the concrete wall with such precision that the gap around it was less than a quarter inch on all sides. She looked for a handle and found nothing. She ran her fingers along the base of the rectangle, pressing at intervals. The concrete was solid. She moved her fingers along the lower edge, feeling for anything different, any variation in the surface. There, Della said. She had crouched down beside her mother and was looking at a single block near the lower right corner of the hidden door, a block that was fractionally recessed compared to the surrounding wall, its surface slightly different in texture, as if it had been set separately from the pour, rather than poured as part of it. Della looked at Ren. Ren nodded. Della placed both palms flat against the block and pressed. Not hard, steadily, the patient, even pressure of a child pressing a stock drawer, rather than the force of someone trying to break something open. A sound came from inside the wall, low and mechanical, something moving that had not moved in a very long time. Then a section of wall, a heavy section, 6 inches thick. At least the hidden door swung inward on hinges that had been kept oiled by some combination of August's preparation and the cedar dry air that had preserved everything else smooth and heavy and slow, like something that wanted to be opened but was in no hurry about it. The smell that came out of the opening was cedar so concentrated it was almost a taste, dense and golden and so present that Wren stood in it for a moment before she raised the flashlight and put the beam through the doorway. The light found the leg of a table. The leg was walnut dark and deep-grained, carved along its length into a shape that was not decorative in the way of ornament, but structural in the way of nature, the shape of a root, thick at the top where it joined the table surface and branching at the bottom into smaller forms that grip the floor, the way a tree grips the earth with the kind of solidity that does not announce itself. Wren stepped through the doorway. The room was 20 feet by 20 feet, and it was full. She moved the flashlight slowly, and her mind assembled the space piece by piece, the way it had assembled the property from a distance, component by component, each one more than she had expected, and then another one. The dining table sat in the center of the room, its walnut surface deep as still water and perfectly smooth, unmarked by use because it had never been used. It had been made and sealed and preserved, and it had waited. Around it, 8 chairs, their backs carved in the pattern of wheat stalks, each one with a slight, deliberate variation, so that no two were quite identical, each one its own thing within the set. The table could seat 12 if you brought in the extra chairs that stood against the wall to the left, 4 of them in a row, simpler in design, made to match. Against the far wall, a bed frame of the same dark walnut, 4-posted, the headboard rising to a height of 4 feet and carved across its full width with the image of a sun rising above a horizon line. Not a sun with rays in the stylized sense. A sun as it actually looks at the moment of rising a curve, a suggestion light beginning at the edge of the world, and you have to decide whether you're watching it start or watching it grow. To the right, a glass-fronted cabinet, its frame cherry, its panes, the wavy glass of old manufacture containing inside it a collection of smaller works. A jewelry box inlaid with a geometric pattern in lighter wood. A chess set, pieces in board, both the pieces carved as figures from American history that Wren could not quite identify from a distance. A child's jewelry box with painted flowers. And in the corner beside the cabinet, nearly the same height as the cabinet itself, the hope chest. It was cherry wood, the color of deep autumn, and its surface was covered in an inlay pattern of mother-of-pearl stars. Not regular stars, but stars of varying sizes and distances from each other, arranged the way stars are actually arranged, which is to say without human symmetry, which is to say true. The chest caught the flashlight and returned it in fragments, small, cool gleams distributed across its surface like light on water. And against the wall to Wren's right, in the far corner beneath a workbench that held the tools of August Merritt's trade, laid out with the orderliness of someone who intended to come back and use them, hand planes with brass fittings, chisels with turned handles, saws with etched blades, stood a rocking horse. It was cedar pale and fine-grained, and it had been made with the same loving precision as everything else in the room. The body was exact, the proportions of a real horse rendered in miniature, with the accuracy of someone who had looked at a horse carefully and tried to understand rather than approximate. The mane was carved in motion, individual strands, suggested by the carving tool flowing back from the neck, in a curve that implied speed or wind. The head was lifted and turned very slightly to one side, and the eye, a smooth, polished stone set into the wood, dark brown, almost black, had the quality of looking at something. Della made a sound that was not a word. It was the sound a body makes when something reaches it from outside in a way that bypasses the mind's ordinary filtering. She crossed the room to the horse with the quickness of a child who has stopped calculating and moved towards something on instinct, and she put both hands on the mane and stood very still. Then she turned to Wren with a face that was open in a way it had not been open in 4 months. "Mama," she said. "It looks like Daddy's horse." Wren was already crossing the room toward her. She knew what she was going to see before she got there because she had heard it in her daughter's voice, the particular timbre of recognition, the sound of someone encountering something they already know. But knowing it was coming did not change what it did to her when she stood beside Della and looked at the carved horse and understood. Owen had drawn horses for Della since she was 3 years old. They were always the same horse, not because he lacked imagination, but because he had found the horse in his imagination, and it was always that one, always with the flowing mane and the lifted head and the slight turn that made it look as if it was looking at something just out of frame. He had drawn it on napkins and on the backs of receipts and on the margins of grocery lists and on notebook paper torn into squares and on the inside covers of Della's chapter books when she asked him to put something on the blank page. It was the horse of a man who had no formal training in drawing, but who loved his daughter enough to have invented for her a specific horse that belonged to their specific language. The horse August Merritt had carved in cedar in the winter of 1936 in a sealed underground room in Kansas during the worst economic crisis of the century by the light of a single lantern for a daughter he prayed he might someday have, was the same horse. Not similar, not reminiscent of. The same horse, the same lifted head, the same flowing mane, the same slight turn, the same eye that was looking at something. Wren put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and could not speak. There was no explanation for it. She would not find one. She would stop looking for one eventually, not because she gave up, but because she came to understand that some things don't resolve into explanations. They resolve into meanings which are different. The meaning of this was not something she could have articulated standing in that room with her hands not quite steady, but she felt it. The way you feel the ground under your feet, certain and present and larger than any particular interpretation. She thought about what it meant that the hands of men who loved their daughters made the same thing without knowing each other, without any connection across 60 years of distance and change. What it said about love, what it said about the shape that love takes when it expresses itself in objects. She thought about Owen. She thought about August. She stood there in the cedar-scented dark with her daughter's shoulder under her hand and did not try to think past it. After a while, she remembered the box in the outer room. She went back and carried it through the doorway into the larger space, and she sat in the wooden chair that August had left beside the small table, and Della sat on the floor beside her with the bear in her lap, leaning slightly against Wren's leg, the way she used to before all of it, before the silences in the distance, the way she used to on Sunday mornings on the couch when they watched movies together, and Della would press her whole side against Wren's side as if physical contact with her mother was a form of navigation. Wren held the flashlight and opened the top envelope, the one addressed to her. August Merritt's handwriting filled 3 pages of thin paper, the script even, and deliberate, the letter of a man who did not write quickly or carelessly, who understood that what he was setting down would need to survive him by many years and be legible and true when it arrived. "My dearest grandchild of my grandson," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am long gone and you have found your way home. I hope life has been kind to you in the years since I wrote this, but I suspect it has not been entirely kind. I suspect you came to this place because you had nowhere else to go. That is all right. This place was built for that purpose, among others." Wren read. She read about the spring of 1936 and the dust storms that turned day into night, and the bank that came with its papers and its patient certainty. She read about August's decision, not a decision made quickly or easily, but arrived at the way difficult decisions are through nights of calculation and the particular clarity that comes when desperation has burned away everything that isn't true. She read about the plan he and Eleanor had made together, the two of them on the porch watching a wall of dust roll in from the west, Eleanor's rough garden hand taking his, and the words she said that had been a spark in the darkness. "Your hands can make beautiful things. They can make strong things. We are not broken yet." She read about the performance August telling people he was leaving, letting the neighbors see him load junk into the truck, meeting the banksman with the face of a defeated man, and signing over the deed for a few $100s. She read about the careful approach to the out-of-state investor who had acquired the land in a bundle of worthless properties, and the letter written under a false name offering $100 for the merit plot, just one more hopeless piece of Kansas dirt, and the investor's quick acceptance. She read about 6 months underground, about Eleanor's quiet strength in the narrow space, about the son, David, too young to understand what was happening, who coughed in the close air and played with a small wooden car his father had made from a scrap of oak and smiled when he found it under his pillow. About August descending to this room night after night by the light of a lantern that burned through the winter and spring, working the wood he had saved, the walnut and cherry and cedar, the carefully preserved timber of a craftsman who had known for years that the finest wood should be saved for the finest occasion, into the objects of a life he intended to build when this was over. I was not making furniture, the letter said. I was making proof. Proof that what I knew how to do could not be taken by a bank or a drought or the particular cruelty of an economic system that had decided men like me were expendable. Every joint I cut, every surface I planed was an argument. I am still here. I still know how to make something that will last. Wren stopped reading when her eyes wouldn't focus. She sat with the pages in her hands and breathed. Della reached up and put her hand over her mother's and held it there. After a long time, Wren read the rest. Look at the wall behind you. There is a seam, a hidden door. On the other side of it, you will find what I made in those 6 months. It is yours. It is your birthright in the truest sense of the word, not what an institution says belongs to you, but what your family made with their hands and their faith and their refusal to disappear. You will also find under the workbench a small metal box. Inside that box, you will find money. I never trusted banks again after 1936. I lived simply. I worked. I saved. I put it all away right here over the years because I trusted that eventually the right person would come and know what to do with it. Use the money to free yourself from the immediate pressure of your situation. But the furniture, the tools, the journals, those are your true inheritance. They are the evidence of what your family is. We are builders. We make things that last. Whatever the world has told you about your worth, whatever circumstances have suggested about your value, know this. You come from people who went underground and made something beautiful in the dark and came back up into the light. The light always comes. Find your way to it. Your great-grandfather, August Elias Merritt, Harlan, Kansas, 1993. Wren folded the pages carefully and set them back in the envelope. She got up and went to the workbench. Beneath it, pushed back against the wall, almost invisible in the shadows, until you knew to look for it, was a small metal box about the size of a shoebox wrapped in a double layer of oilcloth. She pulled it out and set it on the workbench and peeled back the oilcloth. Inside, in neat stacks separated by folded paper, were bills. Old denominations, the faces and designs of several decades held together by rubber bands that had gone brittle and broke at the touch. She didn't count it. She didn't need to count it to know that it was more than $60,000. It had the density of many years of deliberate saving, the accumulation of a man who had meant every cent of it for this purpose. She stood at the workbench for a long time, her hands on the box, the light from the flashlight propped against the wall, throwing long shadows across the room, across the walnut table, and the wheat-stalk chairs, and the hope chest with its mother-of-pearl stars, and the cedar horse. That was Owen's horse, and August's horse, and Della's horse, and somehow all three at once. She heard Della's voice from the corner. "Mama, come look." She walked to where Della was standing near the rocking horse, the bear in the crook of her arm, pointing at something on the wall behind the horse. It was a small carving made directly in the cedar paneling that lined this section of the wall, not mounted or framed, just carved directly into the wood with the same precision as everything else August had made. Two figures, one large and one small, the larger one with its arm around the smaller one's shoulder. Below them, carved in the same hand as the letters outside on the stone, two words: "Come home." Della looked up at her mother. "I think he was talking about us, Mama," she said. Wren looked at the carving for a long time. Then she reached out and placed her fingertips against the carved letters and felt the grooves of them, the deliberate depth of a man who had put something into the wood that he wanted to be sure would hold. Then she sat back down in the wooden chair and she let herself cry. Not for long. There was still so much to do. But for the necessary duration of it, for August and Eleanor and David, who grew up ashamed of what had saved him, and for Owen, who had drawn the same horse without knowing he was drawing it, and for Della, who had gone somewhere inside herself and was coming back now, slowly and for real and for herself, for all the nights in the parking lots and the rest stops and the orange plastic chairs, for all the times she had looked at her hands and not been sure they were worth anything. She allowed it. Della pressed against her side and held on. Outside above them, through 15 feet of Kansas earth, Silas Drummond stood in the September light and did not move and did not call down and waited for as long as it took, the way a man waits who has been waiting a long time already and understands that waiting done right is its own form of faithfulness. What honest hands build. The courthouse in Harlan was a brick building on the corner of First Street and County Road 12, 3 stories with a limestone cornice and a flagpole out front that had been there since 1923. It smelled on the inside like floor wax and old paper, in the particular institutional stillness of a place where decisions had been made for a very long time. The wood of the benches had been worn smooth by the sitting of countless people who had come here with something to resolve, and the light through the tall windows came in at a long morning angle that made everything look more serious than it might otherwise have. Wren sat in the front row behind Harriet Voss's table and watched Preston Allgate across the aisle. He was composed. She had expected nothing less. He wore a dark suit today instead of the polo shirt and khakis, which was the appropriate costuming for a man who had decided that this setting required a different presentation. His attorney, a man named Gareth Sills, who had driven up from Wichita the night before, sat beside him with a briefcase that contained, Harriet had told Wren, a set of documents that were going to require careful dismantling. Della was with Opal Strickland, who had offered without being asked to take her for the day, who had said she needed help counting inventory at the general store, and that a second pair of eyes would be useful, which was almost certainly not true, but which Della had accepted with the gravity of someone given a genuine responsibility. Wren had kissed her daughter's forehead that morning in the motel parking lot, and Della had said, "You're going to win, Mama," with the certainty of a child who has not yet learned to hedge. Judge Patricia Morrow took the bench at 9 o'clock with the unhurried authority of someone who had been doing this long enough to understand that the performance of authority was a waste of everyone's time. She was 61, gray-haired, wearing reading glasses on a chain around her neck that were identical to Harriet's, which Wren chose to take as a sign of nothing but noted anyway. Harriet presented the case with the same quality of patient precision she brought to everything. No flourishes, no dramatic pauses, no rhetorical gestures toward the gallery. She was a woman who had been practicing law in Harlan County for more than 20 years, and who understood that a well-organized argument required no decoration. She began with the will. August Merritt's original document, executed in 1988 and amended twice the last amendment in 1993, was a model of deliberate language. Every clause addressed a specific contingency. The direct heir condition was not ambiguous. It had been reviewed by 3 separate attorneys over its history, each of whom had found it clear and enforceable. The property, including everything on and under it, passed to the direct lineal heir upon satisfaction of the personal condition, the opening of the sealed cellar by the heir's own hands. The condition had been satisfied. Harriet presented photographic documentation of the cellar opening, dated and witnessed in the signed affidavit of Silas Drummond, who had been present. She presented the contents of the estate, the furniture, the tools, the journals, the money, and their assessed value, which a Wichita antiques specialist had estimated after examining photographs. The furniture alone, she said, in the work of a craftsman of August Merritt's demonstrated skill in historical context, was worth between $300,000 and $400,000 to the right buyer or institution. The Depression-era provenance added considerable significance. The tools, the journals, the documented history of the underground preservation, all of it together constituted an estate of substantial value. Then she placed the claim against the estate. Carl Briggs, she said, had submitted documentation claiming descent from Malcolm Merritt through an illegitimate daughter. She set the documents on the table in front of her and put her reading glasses on and examined them for a moment. She noted that the birth certificate at the center of the claim had been issued in a county in which no such record existed in the state archive. She noted that the name of the attending physician listed on the document had not been licensed in Kansas in the year indicated. She noted that the signature of the county registrar was inconsistent with other signatures from that registrar in that period. She set each piece of the documentation down in order as she addressed it the way a person lays out cards that are not going to win a hand. Then she called Silas Drummond. He walked to the witness stand with the same unhurried economy of motion he brought to everything, settled into the chair, and folded his hands on the railing. Judge Morrow looked at him over her reading glasses for a moment with the expression of someone who had known this man long enough to find his presence in her courtroom significant. "Mr. Drummond," Harriet said. "How long did you know August Merritt?" "51 years, Silas said. "Can you tell the court about Malcolm Merritt?" Silas looked at the judge rather than at the gallery. "Malcolm Merritt was August's younger brother," he said. "Born 1925. Enlisted in the Army in 1943 at age 18. He died at the Hurtgen Forest in November 1944. He was 19 years old. He had been in Europe for less than 6 months." "Did August ever speak to you about whether Malcolm had any children?" "Many times. August was clear on the subject. Malcolm was 19 when he died and had never been seriously involved with anyone. August outlived his brother by 51 years and spent a significant portion of that time ensuring the historical record was accurate because he knew what kind of claims people would eventually make." Harriet picked up the envelope from her table. "I'm entering into evidence a document executed by August Merritt in October of 1982. It is a personal declaration witnessed by Mr. Drummond and attested by 2 additional residents of Harlan County and accompanied by the fingerprints of both August Merritt and Mr. Drummond." She handed copies to the judge and to Gareth Sills, who accepted his with the careful expression of a man who had already understood that this day was not going to go the way his client had planned. "The document states," Harriet said, and she read it clearly without emphasis, letting the language carry itself, "that Malcolm Merritt died without issue and without known descendants, that any claim of descent from Malcolm Merritt is false, and that August Merritt was placing this record with a trusted witness against precisely the kind of claim that is now before this court." She set her copy of the document on the table. "August Merritt anticipated this," she said. "He anticipated it because it had already happened once before. The court will note that the document is dated 1982, following an incident in which another individual attempted a similar claim." She looked briefly at Preston, who was watching the middle distance above the judge's bench with an expression of disciplined neutrality that was costing him something. "That previous claimant's name," she said, "was Edmund Aldgate." She let the name rest in the air for a moment. "The same last name as the representative of Summit Land Group who is sitting in this courtroom today," she said. "Not a coincidence. A history." Gareth Sills objected to the characterization. Judge Morrow sustained it technically, but looked at Sills over her glasses with an expression that communicated her view of the objection's merit. Harriet called Opal Strickland, who came in from the hall where she had apparently been waiting, while Della counted inventory at the store with someone Opal had deputized, and who sat in the witness stand with the straightforward bearing of a person who had nothing to say except what was true and was comfortable with both. She talked about August. She talked about the man she had known for 60 years as a child, and then as a young woman, and then as an adult, about his quality of work and his standard of conduct and his relationship to Harlan County, about the wheelchair ramp and the shopping cart, and the dozens of other things she had witnessed or heard about from reliable people over decades. She talked about him with the specificity that comes from genuine knowledge of a person, the details that couldn't be invented or assembled from public records, the small true things. She was followed by Martin Greer, 78, whose grandfather had worked alongside August in the years after the Depression. Then by Louise Prentice, 70, who had bought a dining chair from August in 1979 and still used it. Then by Denny Aldrich, 63, a retired Harlan County deputy whose father had been August's attorney before Harriet and who had grown up hearing about the sealed cellar and the long wait for the right heir. Each of them spoke briefly and without excess. Each of them gave the court a piece of August Merritt that fit exactly with every other piece. A man assembled before the judge from testimony coherent, incomplete, and entirely inconsistent with any interpretation that required him to have been hiding something shameful or unresolved. Gareth Sills cross-examined with the efficiency of a man trying to limit damage. He asked careful questions and received careful answers and made no progress. Then he called Carl Briggs. Carl Briggs was 64 medium height, with the look of a man who had been coached carefully on what to say and was concentrating very hard on saying it. He testified about his grandmother's claim of descent from Malcolm Merritt, about the family story passed down through generations, about the documents he had obtained from a genealogical research service. Harriet cross-examined him for 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, Carl Briggs had confirmed that he had never visited Harlan County before this proceeding, that he had never personally verified any of the documents he had submitted, that he had engaged the Genealogical Research Service at the recommendation of a business associate, and that the business associate's name was Preston Aldgate. Judge Morrow looked at the ceiling for a moment after that last answer. It was not a long look. It was the look of a person confirming to themselves something they had already concluded. Gareth Sills did not call Preston Aldgate to the stand. Preston sat with his hands folded on the table and his face composed and his eyes forward and did not look at Wren. Judge Morrow deliberated for 6 minutes, which Harriet later said was less time than she had expected and significantly more than was strictly necessary. The claim of Carl Briggs against the estate of August Merritt is without merit and without foundation, the judge said. The documentation submitted in support of the claim is fraudulent on its face. The estate passes in full to Wren Calloway as direct lineal heir in accordance with the terms of the will, as satisfied by her personal opening of the sealed cellar on the 14th day of her presence on the property. She set down the paper she had been holding. I am also entering a formal finding that this proceeding constitutes an abuse of legal process. I am placing Summit Land Group and its representative Preston Aldgate on notice that any further action against this estate or this property will result in sanctions. She looked at Preston directly for the first time since the hearing had begun. Mr. Aldgate, this is a small county. This courthouse has a long memory. I'd encourage you to develop one as well. She closed the folder in front of her and left the bench. The courtroom was quiet for a moment. Then chairs moved and voices began, and Harriet turned to Wren and said simply, "It's done." Wren looked across the aisle. Preston Aldgate was putting papers into his briefcase with the careful, methodical movements of a man maintaining composure through the muscle memory of routine. His face was composed. The practiced ease was mostly intact, held in place by whatever it was that held it in place. But something had shifted behind it. Not remorse, not exactly. Something more complicated than remorse. The expression Wren thought of a man who had been running toward a thing for a long time and had finally stopped and could no longer remember clearly what the thing was for. He snapped the briefcase closed and stood. He looked at Wren for the first and only time since the hearing began. She looked back at him. She did not feel what she had expected to feel standing here with the decision handed down and the estate secure and the long effort finished. She had expected something clean triumph or relief or at least the satisfaction of a completed thing. What she felt was more complicated than any of those. She felt something she couldn't name precisely looking at Preston Aldgate that had to do with the distance between the two of them and the narrowness of it. Between a woman who had gone underground and stayed and a man who had circled above ground for 30 years, refusing to let go. She thought about what Silas had told her, about Preston's father who had tried the same claim in 1982 and been turned away by August with a clarity that left an impression. About Preston growing up in the shadow of that story, inheriting the belief that something here had been wrongly kept from his family, that the land and what lay beneath it represented an injustice he was owed the resolution of. The economics of the 1980s had taken land from many families. It was possible, even likely, that the Aldgate family had been among them, had lost something real, had carried real grievance, and that Preston had grown up with a wound and had attached it to this property because this property was the only available target. She did not forgive him for what he had tried to do to her and Della. The fraudulent documents, the escalating pressure, the assembly of legal threats designed to exhaust her into surrender. She did not forgive any of it, but she understood it in a way she hadn't before, and understanding it made it smaller. Not insignificant, smaller. He walked past her without speaking and out through the courtroom doors, and Gareth Sills followed him, and then the room was full of Harlan County people shaking Harriet's hand and Wren's hand and saying the things people say in small towns when a thing that has been unresolved for a long time is finally resolved. The property was hers, free and clear. She stood on the courthouse steps afterward in the September light, which had mellowed into October light while she had been working on the cellar and was now full October lower and more golden, the kind of light that is aware of its own scarcity and makes everything it touches more itself. The oaks on the distant ridge had gone amber and rust. The grass was the color of the plains in autumn, deeper than summer gold, heavier with the accumulated warmth of a season finishing. She had $37 in her wallet and several $100,000 worth of Depression-era furniture in an underground room on her property, and the back taxes had been paid from the box under August's workbench the morning after she found it paid in full in Harriet's office, with Harriet's expression moving through several things it didn't usually display. And the property was hers. She breathed the October air and let the sun press against her face, and thought about how the same sun had pressed against August's face when he came up out of the ground in 1937, blinking into the Kansas spring, Eleanor beside him, and David holding Eleanor's hand, three people who had held on in the dark and come back into the light. She went to the general store to get Della. Della was behind the counter, not playing at being behind the counter, actually behind it, standing on a step stool. Opal had found somewhere helping a customer locate something on the shelf behind her, with the seriousness of someone who takes their responsibilities to heart. The customer, an older man in a feed cap, was waiting with the patience of someone who found this arrangement charming, but was also genuinely in need of whatever he'd asked for. Here, Della said, and produced the item, a box of wooden matches, with the satisfaction of successful retrieval. The man paid and said thank you, and Della said, "You're welcome. Have a good day," with Opal's cadence but her own voice. She looked at her mother when the door closed. "Did you win?" "We won," Wren said. Della absorbed this. "Good," she said. "Opal says I can come back Saturday if I want to." "Then we'll come back Saturday," Wren said. Opal was leaning in the doorway of the back room with her arms crossed and an expression that was doing its best to be neutral and wasn't quite succeeding. She caught Wren's eye over Della's head. Wren held the look for a moment and let it communicate what words didn't need to. Opal nodded once and went back to her inventory. The house took 6 months to repair, and the work of those 6 months was the longest and most difficult and most necessary thing Wren had ever done. She had never repaired a house before. She had never replaced a section of subflooring, or reframed a porch post, or reshingled a section of roof, or repointed deteriorated mortar, or done any of the 100 specific tasks that a house neglected for 30 years requires. She had been a teacher of third-grade reading comprehension, whose practical skills extended to cooking and gardening and basic home maintenance and absolutely nothing further. She learned. She learned because the money from August's box after the taxes were paid and the immediate debt settled was enough to fund the materials, but not enough to fund the labor at contractor rates. And because she understood with a clarity that came from having spent 14 days breaking iron with a hammer that her hands were capable of more than she had previously asked of them. She learned from Silas, who knew the bones of old houses the way he knew everything practical from the inside out. She learned from a retired contractor named Pete Holloway, who came by one Saturday in October ostensibly to see how the old Merritt place was coming along, and who ended up spending 4 Saturdays walking her through structural assessments and showing her how to read what a house was telling you about itself. She made mistakes, she repaired the mistakes, she made different mistakes and repaired those too. The mistakes themselves were useful. They told her where her understanding was incomplete, and incompleteness, she was finding, was not a fixed state. There was something in the work that she had not expected, something beyond the practical progress of it. Each day she spent on the house, she was also spending on herself, building something internal alongside the external. A kind of competence that was different from the competence of teaching which she had possessed and valued. This was competence that lived in the body and the hands, in the accumulated physical understanding of materials and their behavior. She thought about August at his workbench in the underground room. She thought about his phrase. She was not running, she was building. The furniture came up from the underground room in early November, piece by piece, carried by Silas and Pete Holloway, and 3 men from town who had heard what was down there and shown up on a Saturday morning with no invitation and strong backs. The dining table came up last because it was the largest and the heaviest, the walnut surface gleaming in the daylight for the first time in 87 years. And when they carried it through the front door of the repaired house and set it down in the dining room, Silas stood back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "August made that in the dark," he finally said. 6 months underground by a lantern. He paused. "Turned out all right. They put the hope chest at the foot of Wren's bed, because August had built it for Eleanor, and it belonged in a bedroom where someone slept. Inside it, folded in cedar-scented wool, were two quilts handmade, the patterns geometric and faded, and still beautiful, that Eleanor had apparently placed there herself before the ceiling, and that had survived 9 decades in the dark, without deteriorating, the cedar doing precisely what cedar is for. The rocking horse went in Della's room. Della named it Hope and told it things she was not ready to say out loud. Wren heard her sometimes through the wall at night, telling it what she was thinking about school, and the girl named Rosemary who sat beside her in class, and the red-tailed hawk she'd been watching from the porch, and what she thought about the stars over Kansas, which were different from Ohio stars, in ways she was still figuring out. The horse never answered. It didn't need to. That was the thing about certain kinds of listening. Della had started school in Harlan in October. The school was smaller than Millbrook, fewer children per grade, and the particular social ecosystem of a small-town school was different from what she had known, more interconnected, less easy to be invisible, in which could have been hard, but turned out to be good. Kids in small towns know when something has happened to a person, even if they don't know the details, and some children respond to that knowledge with the specific generosity of having grown up watching adults help each other through things. She made a friend named Rosemary, whose parents farmed the county road east of Harlan, who had a horse, a real one, named Biscuit. Della came home from her second visit to the Aldrich farm and said very seriously that Biscuit was fine, but not as good as Hope, and Wren kept her face straight and said that was probably the most honest assessment she could make. Della laughed. A real laugh, full-throated and sudden and surprised at itself, the laugh of a child who has rediscovered that laughter is possible. It lasted only a moment, but it had the quality of something coming back to life, not slowly and partially, but all at once, the way a room looks when you turn on a light. The winter was hard in the way Kansas winters are, not spectacular, but sustained. Cold that settled in and stayed, gray days that followed one another without apology. The prairie wind that came across the flat land with nothing to slow it down and arrived at the house with something like argument. Wren kept the furnace running and the pipes from freezing, and learned in the process how the old house managed cold, which it did better than she'd expected, because August had built the walls thick and the insulation was in the places that mattered, still intact. She began making things. It started because the library in Harlan needed new shelving. The old shelves had warped badly, and the librarian, a quiet woman named Nell Fraser, had mentioned it to Opal, who mentioned it to Wren one Thursday in a way that was almost entirely casual, and not quite. Wren went to the library, looked at the shelves, went home and looked at the tools August had left in the underground room, and spent 2 evenings at the workbench learning what the tools were for by using them on scrap wood. The shelving she delivered to the library in January was not beautiful the way August's work was beautiful. It was plain and it was solid, and the joinery held, and the proportions were correct. Nell Fraser looked at it for a long time and then said quietly that it looked like it was made to stay. That was enough. The next piece was a cradle for a neighbor named Carla Whitmore, who was expecting in February and who had come by the house once with Opal and mentioned in the half-apologetic way of people who don't want to presume that she'd heard Wren was working with wood and that she'd always wanted a handmade cradle for the baby but couldn't afford to commission one from a proper craftsman. Wren made the cradle from cherry. There was cherry in August's reserve of timber, kept in a dry rack against one wall of the underground room, still sound after decades. She worked on it for 3 weeks, and she made mistakes and corrected them, and by the end, she had something that was better than the library shelves, and not yet as good as what August could have made, but genuine in the way that things made with real effort and real care are genuine. The cradle had a curve to the hood that she had worked out through several failed attempts, a curve that was the right curve because it asked for it, and she kept trying until she found it. Carla Whitmore cried when she saw it. Wren told her not to do that, which was not effective. Word traveled the way word travels in a small town, not through announcement, but through conversation, through the natural circulation of information in a community where people paid attention to each other's circumstances. By March, Wren had 3 more commissions: a bookcase for a retired minister, a kitchen table for a young couple who had moved into the county, and a toy chest for a family in Harlan who had seen the cradle at Carla's house. She was not August. She would not be August for many years, and perhaps never fully, because some things take a lifetime to develop, and she had arrived late to this particular education. But she was learning. And she was working, and every day she stood at the bench with her hands on the wood, she understood more clearly what August had understood about the relationship between a person and what they made, that making things was not separate from being a person, but was one of the ways a person was most fully themselves. She thought about that, about third grade reading comprehension and the children who had stayed after school. She thought about what it was that she had loved about teaching, not the curriculum, not the institutional structures, but the moment when a child who had been struggling with something suddenly understood it, when the confusion cleared and the comprehension arrived, and you could see it in their face. The moment of capacity realized. That was what she had loved. It was she understood now the same thing she was doing at the workbench, the same essential thing expressed differently. April arrived and the property began to change. The grass came back greener and taller than it had been in the fall. The wildflowers Della had been collecting all autumn returned in greater numbers. The creek at the far corner of the property, which had been running low in the dry days of autumn, filled and moved with purpose. The oaks on the ridge, leafed out in the particular bright green of new oak leaves, almost translucent in the morning light. Wren put in a garden along the south side of the house. Not a large one. Tomatoes and basil and one rose bush, a climbing variety she found at the feed store planted against the porch trellis, which she had repaired over the winter. She did not expect much from it in the first year, but she put it in because there had been a rose bush at the house on Elm Terrace, and she had loved it. And because August had built this house to be lived in, and living in a house meant making it yours, and this was how she made it hers. Della helped with the garden. She had strong opinions about the spacing of the tomato plants, which she had researched with methodical thoroughness after deciding she wanted to be involved, and which were largely correct based on the stakes she drove to indicate where each plant should go. Wren planted them where Della directed. By July, they were producing. On a Tuesday morning in late May, a letter arrived. It was in a Department of Family Services envelope, and Wren's hands tightened on it before she opened it, the old reflex, the memory of what a DSS envelope had meant the last time. She stood at the kitchen table in the morning light, coming through the window that looked out over the yard, and breathed and opened it. It was not what she expected. The letter was from a woman named Susan Beaumont, caseworker, Division of Family Services, Carver, Ohio. Wren did not recognize the name, but the letterhead was from the same office, possibly the same desk, as the woman who had stamped Della's file like closing a coffin. She read it standing at the table. Susan Beaumont wrote that she had been following the resolution of the Callaway case with personal interest that she had heard through professional channels about what had happened in Kansas, about the property and the seller and the estate. She wrote that she was aware of the circumstances that had brought Wren to that particular office on that particular day, and that she understood those circumstances in a way she had not always understood them. Then she wrote that there was a family in her caseload, a young woman named Loretta Marsh, 26 years old, with a daughter named Willa, age 6. Loretta had been working 2 jobs and living with her sister when the sister's apartment situation changed and the arrangement collapsed and there was nowhere to go. Loretta had no family in a position to help. The shelter system was as it always was full. Social services was trying to identify emergency placement options. I am writing to you, Susan Beaumont wrote, not because I think this is your obligation, but because I have heard that you have built something in Harlan County that started from nothing and that you have more room there than 2 people need. I am writing because I believe you know what it is to have nowhere to go. And I am asking, not directing or requiring, but asking whether you might be able to offer Loretta and Willa a place to stay while we work on longer-term options. I am also writing because I owe you an apology, not for doing my job, but for the way I did it on the day you sat across from me. I treated your file as paperwork. You were not paperwork. I have thought about that since, and I am sorry for it. Wren set the letter on the table. She stood at the window and looked at the yard, at the garden, the tomato stakes, the rose bush coming up the trellis, the porch swing she had hung from the repaired beam last week, the tall grass of the property beyond the yard moving in the May wind. She thought about August and Eleanor in this house. She thought about the table with 12 chairs that was now in her dining room, a table built in an underground room during the worst years of a century, built not for the people who were there, but for the people who would eventually come and need somewhere to sit together. She thought about seats at that table that were empty. She heard Della come down the stairs, her feet on the steps, the sound of morning. Della came into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and looked at her mother looking out the window and at the letter on the table. She looked at the return address. "What does it say?" she asked. Wren turned from the window. "Someone needs our help," she said. "A mother and a little girl. They don't have anywhere to go." Della held her water glass and considered this. How old is the little girl? 6. Della thought about this with the seriousness she brought to consequential questions. "She could have my old room," Della said. "I have the bigger one now." Wren looked at her daughter. "You sure about that?" Della set her glass down on the counter with the decisiveness of someone who had made a decision and was done making it. "We have room, Mama," she said. "You always say people need room." Wren wrote back to Susan Beaumont that afternoon. The letter was short. She said yes. She gave the address and the phone number and said that there was a room ready when Loretta and Willa needed it and that there was no particular timeline on her end. She signed it Wren Calloway, and below her name, she wrote the address of the property, and below that, in a moment of impulse, she didn't second guess, she wrote, "We have room." Loretta and Willa arrived on a Tuesday in June. The car they came in was a 2009 Hyundai that had been borrowed from a friend of Loretta's and that had made the drive from Ohio to Kansas in a single long day that had clearly taken everything the car had. Loretta was 26, dark-haired, with the kind of face that had learned to hold itself carefully in public and had not yet had sufficient practice at not having to. She stood beside the car in the late afternoon light with a duffel bag over one shoulder and her daughter's hand in her other hand and looked at the house the way people look at things they don't yet know how to trust. Willa was 6 small for her age with her mother's dark hair cut short. She held onto Loretta's hand and looked at everything, the house, the yard, the garden, the open prairie beyond, with round, serious eyes that were taking thorough inventory. Della was on the porch when they pulled up. She had been there for 20 minutes, having established her monitoring position early, and she came down the steps with the purposefulness of someone who had decided how this was going to go. She stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at Willa. "Do you like horses?" she said. Willa looked at her. "Real ones or drawing ones?" "We have a wood one," Della said. "His name is Hope. You can look at him if you want." Willa looked up at her mother, who gave the small nod that mothers give when they are saying it's okay. "Go ahead." Willa let go of Loretta's hand and followed Della up the porch steps and into the house. Wren came down from the porch and stood beside Loretta, who was watching the door where the girls had gone inside. Loretta's jaw was working the way it does when a person is holding something back by concentration. "You don't have to explain anything," Wren said. "Not today. Not until you're ready." Loretta looked at her. The careful public face had a crack in it. "I don't understand why you're doing this," she said. "You don't know us." Wren thought about how to answer that. She thought about a sealed door and a letter addressed to her name. She thought about an old man who had put his faith in someone he'd never met. She thought about what it meant to receive something like that, not just the material inheritance, but the act of faith itself, the decision to trust across distance and time that someone worth trusting would eventually come. She thought about what you did with something like that. What you did was you passed it on. You didn't keep it. You couldn't keep it by holding it. You kept it by giving it. "I know enough," she said. "Come inside." They ate dinner at August's table that evening, the first meal for all 4 of them, and the conversation was not smooth or easy. Loretta was still guarded. Willa was still assessing, and there were silences that sat in the room with a weight that everyone felt and no one pointed to. But the food was hot, and the table was solid, and the evening light came through the dining room windows at a long June angle that made the walnut surface glow. And toward the end of the meal, Willa said, looking at the table, "Did someone make this?" "My great-great-grandfather," Dishla said. "He made it underground, in the dark." Willa looked at the table. "Why?" "Because he was waiting for people to come and use it," Della said with the absolute confidence of someone who has been told a true thing and has absorbed it completely. Willa looked at Dame, then she looked at the table again, then she picked up her fork and finished her dinner. After the girls were asleep, Willa in Della's old room, Della in the larger room down the hall, their voices audible through the walls for a while and then quiet, Wren walked out to the cellar. She did this sometimes in the evenings, not often, but sometimes when the day had been full enough that she needed a few minutes of something that was the opposite of full. She walked through the tall grass in the summer dark, the fireflies doing their small bright work in the field to the east, the creek audible in the distance, the stars overhead beginning their nightly business of being enormous and patient and indifferent in the way that is not cold, but rather very clean. The cellar doors were open. She had left them open since the day she found what was inside propped back flush with the grass so that the cool cedar-scented air could move between the underground and the above. She liked the idea of them open. She liked the idea of the separation dissolved of August's room, breathing the same air as the prairie. She sat on the stone step at the top of the stairs and looked at the sky. It was the same sky August had watched from this spot. The same stars, or rather, the same star's light, arriving now as it had always arrived, carrying its information across distances that made all human distances seem like errors of scale. The same stars he had looked at in the spring of 1937, when he came up out of the earth blinking and alive, the same stars he had looked at in 1993 when he wrote her name on an envelope and placed it in a metal box and sealed a room and trusted. She had the journal on her lap. She had been reading through it in segments over the months, a few pages at a time, because it was the kind of document that required the right amount of room around each reading. The final entries were the ones she returned to most often. Not because they were the most dramatic, but because they were the most settled, the entries of a man who had arrived somewhere and knew it. She opened to the last page and read it again in the starlight, which was bright enough for reading once her eyes adjusted, a fact that pleased her and that she suspected would have pleased August. January 14th, 1993, he had written, "I am 91 years old today. Eleanor has been gone 12 years, and I miss her with a clarity that does not diminish. I have been thinking about the cellar today, as I do on certain days. I have been thinking about the person who will eventually come and open those doors. I don't know who they will be. I know their name, I have made sure of that, but I don't know what they will have survived to get here or what the world will have asked of them by the time they arrive. I know only that they will be mine, which is to say that whatever they carry when they come, they carry as one of us, as someone who comes from people who know what to do in the dark. I hope they find what I left them. I hope they understand what I meant by it. I hope they know when they read this that they were never going to disappear. That is not what our family does. We build. We hold on. We find each other across whatever distance the world puts between us. I hope they pass it on." She closed the journal. She sat on the stone step for a while longer, listening to the creak and the fireflies, and the sound of the house behind her, which was the sound of a house that had people in it. Small creaks and settled silences. The particular acoustic quality of rooms that were occupied and warm. Then she reached into the canvas bag she had brought with her and took out the metal box. She had made a new letter. She had written it over several evenings, slowly working on it, the way she worked on the furniture, trying each thing, reconsidering, trying again, looking for the right words, the way you look for the right curve in a piece of wood. Not performing, not constructing, just trying to say the true thing in the true way. She opened the box. August's envelopes were inside and his journal's companion documents in the silver flask. She set her letter in among them, and beside the letter, she placed something else, a drawing that Della had made the previous week without being asked on the back of a brown paper bag from the general store, using a set of colored pencils Opal had given her. The drawing showed the house from the outside, from the angle of the yard. The windows were yellow with light. Smoke came from the chimney in the careful spiral that Della used for smoke, a convention she had developed and refined. In the yard, two small figures stood beside each other, one taller, one shorter, both facing the viewer. They were not detailed figures. Della drew people simply as children do, but they were clearly together, clearly belonging to each other, clearly home. Below the figures in the careful, deliberate handwriting of a child who had learned to take the act of writing seriously, Della had written one word: home. Wren set the drawing in the box beside her letter. She held the box on her knees for a moment. Then she looked up at the sky. "Thank you, August," she said. Her voice was quiet, level, the voice of someone saying a true thing directly. "For not giving up, for trusting someone would come, for building what you built and waiting as long as it took." She thought about what she would say next and found that it was simple. "We're here now," she said. "We'll take care of it." The Kansas wind moved across the prairie from the west, bending the tall grass in its long, unhurried waves, carrying the smell of summer earth and the distant water of the creek and the particular clean scent of a June night on the plains. Above her, the stars continued their ancient, patient work of being exactly what they were. The fireflies did their small, bright work in the field. The house behind her held its sleeping people. She closed the metal box and set it gently down on the stone beside her. She sat with her hands in her lap and breathed the summer air and did not try to think past the present moment, which was full enough on its own, full of what had been and what had been survived and what had been built and what was still being built and what would go on being built by hands that knew now what they were for. The light through the cellar doors rose faintly from below the cedar-scented cool of August's room, mixing with the warm night air above. Not two separate things anymore, the same air moving freely between them. She stayed until she was ready to go in. Then she rose from the stone step and walked back through the grass toward the house where the windows were lit and the people inside were sleeping toward the door that was her door in the house, that was her house on the land that had been waiting all this time to be someone's home and had finally, after everything, become one.